At my wedding reception, my mother-in-law took the mic and announced, "I canceled your honeymoon, my son should spend that money on me." I laughed until I checked my bank account and saw it was empty. My husband's next words made her instantly regret everything. I knew my mother-in-law, Diane, didn't like me, but I never thought she would sabotage my marriage before it even started. It was my wedding day, one of the happiest days of my life, until she grabbed the microphone at the reception and made an announcement that turned my stomach inside out. I can still see the way she smirked, enjoying every second of the chaos she was about to cause. She tapped the mic, got everyone's attention, and in the most smug, condescending tone possible, she said, "I have a little surprise for the bride and groom. I decided to do something special for my son, because he deserves the best. So, I went ahead and canceled their honeymoon." The entire room went silent. I laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of sick joke. But then she kept talking. She looked directly at me, her smile growing wider. "I mean, why waste all that money on a trip when my son has real responsibilities? That money is much better spent on family. On me." A few guests laughed nervously, waiting for someone, maybe my husband, maybe me, to say it wasn't true. But then I felt my stomach drop. I glanced at my husband, Jake, expecting him to be just as confused and horrified as I was. But he just stared at his mother, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I knew, in that moment, that this wasn't a joke. My heart started pounding. I reached for my phone under the table and quickly opened my banking app. My fingers were shaking as I logged in. And that's when I saw it. The honeymoon fund, completely drained. Gone. Every single cent. The money we had saved, the money we had received as wedding gifts, it was all gone. My vision blurred. My hands went cold. I turned to Jake, my voice barely a whisper. "Tell me this isn't real." He exhaled sharply, grabbed his own phone, and checked his account. His face darkened. "My account is empty," he muttered. Diane was still standing there, waiting for applause, like she had done something generous. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my drink in her face. But before I could even process what was happening, Jake stood up. And what he said next made Diane instantly regret everything. I could feel the blood draining from my face. My hands were ice cold, my stomach twisting in ways I had never felt before. My entire honeymoon fund, thousands of dollars we had saved together, plus wedding gifts from friends and family, was gone. Jake was gripping his phone so tightly I thought it might crack. His face was unreadable, but his silence was enough to send a chill down my spine. Diane, my monster-in-law, was still standing there, basking in the attention. She actually looked proud of herself. Then Jake stood up. And the way he looked at her? I had never seen him like that before. His expression was sharp, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might shatter his teeth. "Mom," he said slowly, his voice deadly calm. "What did you do?" Diane scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder like she was bored of this conversation already. "Oh, stop being dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes. "I transferred the money where it should have been in the first place. You're a married man now. It's time to grow up and take care of your family." She smiled sweetly, as if she actually expected him to thank her for this. Jake took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "Where's the money, Mom?" I already knew the answer. She sighed, acting like we were being so unreasonable. Then she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I put it in my account, of course. I needed it for some very important things." The audacity. The absolute nerve. Guests around us started whispering. Some were outright gasping. A few of my friends looked at me, their faces full of concern. My maid of honor, Sarah, had her mouth open in shock. I clenched my fists so tightly my nails dug into my palm. "You stole our honeymoon money," I said, my voice shaking. Diane laughed. "Stole?" she repeated, like it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. "Oh honey, don't be dramatic. You're married now. That money should be used for something more responsible, like your husband supporting his mother. I raised him. I deserve it." I couldn't breathe. I was so angry my vision blurred. Jake, however, didn't blink. Instead, he pulled out a chair, sat back down, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. His voice was deadly calm when he said, "Mom, I want you to tell me exactly what you spent our money on." Diane beamed, as if she thought she was winning this. "Well," she said, counting on her fingers, "I paid off some of my credit card bills. Then I put a deposit on a new car, You know I've been wanting that luxury SUV for a while. And, oh, I booked myself a little vacation. A cruise, actually. You'd be so proud of me, honey. I got the penthouse suite. She said it so casually. Like she hadn't just stolen our honeymoon and replaced it with her own. Jake exhaled through his nose. His fingers tapped against the table. Then he did something that shocked me. He smiled. But it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile you see in movies right before everything goes to hell. That's great, Mom, he said slowly. That's really, really great. Diane hesitated. What do you mean? Jake leaned forward. I mean, it's great that you spent money that wasn't yours. Because you know what that means? The room went silent. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around so Diane could see what he was doing. He was calling the bank. Yeah, hi, he said, still looking Diane dead in the eye. I'd like to report fraudulent activity on my account. Diane's smirk vanished. Her eyes widened. Jake, what are you doing? Jake ignored her. Yes, I'd like to dispute several unauthorized transfers. He listened for a second, then nodded. Yeah. I know exactly who did it. I can give you their name and account number right now. Diane shot up from her chair so fast it nearly toppled over. Jake! Stop it. You can't. Oh, I can, he said, still smiling. See, Mom, you're not on my account. You don't have access to my money. Which means you stole it. And banks don't like fraud. Diane's face turned bright red. Guests were staring. Some people were even recording. Jake tilted his head. I wonder how that's gonna look when the bank investigates. Oh, and I should probably call the cruise line too, since you booked that trip with stolen money. Diane gasped. Jake. I'm your mother. You wouldn't, I would. The whole room was watching now. Diane looked around, realizing that nobody, not a single person, was on her side. I could see it in her face. The slow, dawning realization that she had completely screwed herself. But Jake wasn't done yet. He turned to me, took my hand, and squeezed it. Then he looked back at his mother. By the way, Mom, he said. Diane swallowed. What? Jake grinned. You remember that prenup you told me not to sign? The one you said was insulting and a waste of time? She blinked. Of course. Jake's grin widened. Well, he said, I signed it anyway. Diane froze. I actually thought she might faint. Jake shrugged. And guess what? One of the conditions is that all our accounts remain separate. Which means, he gestured toward my phone, you didn't just steal from me. You stole from my wife. The color drained from Diane's face. And just like that, she knew. She wasn't just dealing with her son anymore. She was dealing with me. And I was about to make her regret everything. Diane stood there frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She looked around, probably expecting someone, anyone, to defend her. Nobody did. Her face twisted in panic. Jake, sweetheart, let's not get carried away here. But Jake was done. He put his phone on speaker just as the bank representative came back on the line. Sir, we've flagged the unauthorized transactions. Since the recipient account is under a different name, we can escalate this as fraud. Would you like us to proceed with a full investigation? Diane lunged forward, trying to grab the phone right out of his hand. Jake. Hang up. We can talk about this. Jake leaned away, his voice ice cold. Yeah. Proceed. Diane let out a choked gasp. You wouldn't do that to your own mother. Jake just stared at her. You already did this to yourself. The bank rep continued, understood. We'll be reversing the charges and notifying authorities. This will result in a temporary freeze on the recipient's account while we investigate. If this case is confirmed as fraud, legal action may be taken. Diane screeched. Legal action? No, tell them to stop. Jake, fix this. But Jake wasn't done. Oh, don't worry, Mom, he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. I'll make sure you don't get arrested yet. He smirked. But the money? That's gone. You won't be seeing a single cent of it. I watched as Diane's face twisted in rage. But what she did next? Nobody saw it coming. With a wild look in her eyes, she turned to me. "This is your fault," she shrieked. "You poisoned my son against me. He never would have done this before you came along." I stood my ground, keeping my voice steady. "I didn't make you steal from us. You did that all on your own." Diane's eyes darted around the room, looking for support. But all she saw were people staring in disgust. Then, like a switch flipped in her brain, she did something that made my blood run cold. She smiled. A slow, unsettling smile. "Fine," she said sweetly. "If I can't have the money, then neither can you." Before I could react, she reached into her purse, yanked out her phone, and started furiously typing. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. "What are you doing?" Diane grinned wickedly. "Oh, just making a little phone call," she said. "You see, honey, I might not have access to your bank accounts anymore, but I still have a few tricks up my sleeve." She hit the call button. And when she spoke, her voice was sickly sweet. "Hi, yes, this is Diane. I need to report a stolen credit card." My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was trying to sabotage us. By falsely reporting fraud on our joint wedding account, she could trigger a freeze on the funds, including the honeymoon money we just recovered. I lunged forward. "You psycho," but Jake was faster. He snatched the phone from her hands and put it on speaker. "Ma'am, the fraud department rep said, you're reporting a stolen card? Can you confirm the account holder's name?" Diane paused. Her mouth twitched. She glanced at me, then back at Jake. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Mom. Tell them whose account you're reporting stolen." Diane swallowed hard. Well, it's my son's account, and the bank rep cut her off. "Ma'am, unless you are the primary account holder, you cannot report fraud on this card. False reports will result in legal consequences." Diane's face fell. She looked around the room wildly, realizing she had just screwed herself even more. And Jake? He just laughed. A low, slow laugh that made my heart swell with pride. "Oh, Mom," he said, shaking his head. "You just can't help yourself, can you?" Diane's face flushed deep red. She was shaking. Before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed. She grabbed it, glanced at the screen, and immediately went pale. Jake smirked. "That the bank?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because at that moment, another guest, a family friend, cleared his throat and stood up. "Diane," he said slowly. "You do realize I'm a lawyer, right?" Diane's eyes widened. He crossed his arms. "And what you just did? That was attempted financial fraud. You literally did it in front of 50 people." People started whispering. A few guests nodded in agreement. Diane staggered back. I wasn't." The lawyer raised a hand, cutting her off. "Save it. You might want to get ahead of this before it gets worse." Diane turned to Jake, pleading. "Honey, you're not really going to let them do this to me, are you?" Jake looked at her for a long, hard second. Then he smiled. "You did this to yourself." Diane let out a strangled sob. "Jake, please," but Jake just shrugged. "Enjoy your new vacation, Mom," he said. "It might not be a cruise, but I hear jail cells have a lovely view." Diane's face crumpled. And in that moment, I knew. She finally understood that she had lost. Diane stood there, frozen. Her face had drained of color, her hands shaking at her sides. She had lost control of the situation, and she knew it. But that didn't mean she was done. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, forcing a laugh. "This is ridiculous. Are you really going to ruin your wedding day over a little misunderstanding?" I was done listening to her. I took a step forward. "A misunderstanding?" My voice was shaking, but not from fear, from rage. "You stole from us. You took our honeymoon money, spent it on yourself, and then tried to commit bank fraud in front of 50 witnesses. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a crime." Diane's fake smile twitched. But I wasn't finished. "You keep acting like we owe you something," I said, my voice rising. "Like your son's money, our money, belongs to you." "But guess what, Diane?" I tilted my head. "It doesn't." A few guests clapped. Diane snapped her head around, glaring at the people who dared to support me. But she wasn't just losing control of the night, she was losing control of her son. Jake folded his arms. You know what, Mom? He let out a sharp breath. This is actually the perfect time to tell you something I've been holding back for a while. Diane stiffened. What? Jake didn't look away. I've been done with you for a long time. The only reason I still spoke to you was because I thought, stupidly, that you could change. But you can't. And after tonight? I'm officially cutting you off. Diane's eyes bulged. You don't mean that. Jake's voice was firm. I do. Diane gasped like he had just slapped her. The room was silent. People were watching, waiting to see how this would end. Jake turned to me, took my hand, and kissed my fingers. Then he faced Diane again. You took our money, he said. So now, I'm taking something from you. Diane swallowed hard. You don't have a son anymore. A few people audibly gasped. Diane's entire body shook. You don't mean that, she whispered. Jake didn't flinch. I do. After tonight, I want nothing to do with you. No calls, no visits, no texts. If you ever try to contact me or my wife again, I'll file a restraining order. Diane's breath came out in short, panicked gasps. No, Jake, you can't do this. I'm your mother. I raised you. Jake's expression hardened. And you just showed me exactly what kind of mother you are. Diane cracked. Her face twisted, her body trembling. And then, like a child throwing a tantrum, she screamed. A full-on, blood-curdling scream. She stomped her foot, her entire body shaking with rage. You ungrateful little, Jake grabbed my hand and turned away from her. Come on, babe. Let's go enjoy the rest of our wedding. And just like that, we left her standing there, humiliated, exposed, and completely alone. But the best part? The revenge wasn't over. The aftermath, Diane's downfall the next morning, the fallout began. The bank reversed the transactions. Every single dollar Diane stole was put right back into our accounts. Her luxury car deposit? Cancelled. Her cruise? Gone. Her accounts were frozen. Because of the fraud report, her own bank flagged her account for suspicious activity. She couldn't touch her money for weeks while they investigated. She got a visit from the police. Turns out, banks take fraud pretty seriously. She wasn't arrested, yet, but she was formally warned that any further financial theft would result in charges. She became a social pariah. Word spread fast through the family and community. People cut her off. Friends stopped talking to her. Even some of her own relatives disowned her. But the final blow? The ultimate revenge, her worst nightmare. 3 months later, Jake and I finally went on our honeymoon, a fully upgraded, first-class trip to Greece. Paid for entirely by the wedding guests who despised Diane so much that they sent us extra money just to spite her. We posted photos. Lots of them. Diane? She saw every single one. And according to one of Jake's distant cousins, she cried about it for weeks. Final words: Diane lost everything that day. Her son. Her reputation. Her control. And the best part? She did it all to herself. Jake and I, on the other hand, we've never been happier. We're building a life free from her toxicity. And we have zero regrets. Because at the end of the day, the best revenge is living well. And Diane? She'll have to live with the consequences of her own actions. Forever. The end.